I wanted to share a little bit about my seminary background. I went to a Presbyterian seminary. At the time, I was Presbyterian. Sometimes I joke that they taught the Presbyterianism right out of me. It was a very liberal Presbyterian seminary, and one of the things about liberal Presbyterians is they take their education very seriously. As part of our study, we were required to spend an entire year studying ancient Hebrew and an entire year studying ancient Greek so that we could read the Bible in its most foundational languages. My first year of seminary, I studied ancient Hebrew and scripture. Our studies included historical and literary criticism, some of which revealed that people we say authored certain biblical books probably didn't actually author those books. My education included a review of archaeological evidence that in some cases undermined biblical timelines and discredited the reality of biblical stories that many accept as factually true. We studied the context of these ancient biblical writers and watched for hidden agendas that are all through the Bible, which were typically not so much about theology and religion, but much more about politics and power. And in the midst of this full year of immersion into the Old Testament, I was house sitting for a friend of mine in the Oakland Hills. And her house sat high on a hill. It had no driveway, and the only way up to the house was 72 stairs, which meant that we hardly ever got door-to-door sales calls. But one day when I was sitting in the living room studying for my Hebrew, there was a knock at the door. And when I answered, 2 Jehovah's Witnesses were catching their breath. And in between these heaving breaths, they introduced themselves and their intention to come in and share the good news of their faith. I explained to them that I was in seminary and that I was already committed to a path that was very different from their path. And it would be a waste of their time to persuade me into their fold. But they looked back at those 72 stairs and they said to me, "We came all this way." And so I invited them in. They talked about the Hebrew story of Noah and his ark. They showed me renderings of what the world looked like before, during, and after the great flood. They spoke of God's purpose to condemn sinners, and they spoke of God's mercy. They spoke of Noah's faith and his strength, and the whole time I listened very intently. And when they were winding down, I said, "I told you I would not be influenced by interpretation of this story. My interpretation is different." And I expected that they would then get up and be on their way. But they seemed genuinely interested, and so I continued talking, which is probably one of my less flattering moments in my life. Because what came next is that I proceeded to cite everything I learned about why the flood was scientifically impossible. I cited archaeological evidence that exists to prove that there was no such flood. I cited pre-Noah examples of similar flood stories that this biblical writer would have known and from which he likely drew. I went back to the Hebrew language and pointed out what I saw to be convenient inconsistencies in their English translation. And after some time of this, 2 very discouraged looking witnesses politely thanked me for my time and headed off. Now, I was a liberal Presbyterian then, but you can imagine a liberal Unitarian Universalist doing the same thing. We say we embrace people's religious choices, but the truth is we have our limits. And all of the stories they could have led with that day. Why Noah? You know, we come from this universalist Christian tradition that says that God is surprisingly loving. And because of that surprising love, God is not the sort of entity who would punish people for their sins by wiping out most of creation in one big tragic flood. Love just doesn't do that. But different religions espouse different beliefs. This word religion comes from the same root word that gives us the word ligament. Like ligaments, religion is a binding force. Religion is that which binds us together. Some Christians are bound together by their belief in the fundamental truth of the Bible. Some Christians are bound together by their belief that living their lives like Jesus led his leads to a good life. Quakers are bound together by a belief that something of the divine speaks in and through them if they are just quiet enough to listen. Buddhists are bound together in the belief that humans have the capacity to transcend suffering and live more freely. Religion binds us together with people who share our beliefs so that we might live and die well. But these silos of different religions sometimes also drive people apart. And right now, we might well be in one of the most religiously and politically polarizing times in our country's history. There is a study that came out right after the 2016 presidential election that says, and this is a scientific study that says that Thanksgiving dinner got noticeably shorter in families where there is political diversity. So in families that have these wildly different viewpoints, the average Thanksgiving dinner shortened by 30 to 50 minutes. And I know you're worrying about what I'm worrying about. Did they get their pie? Now, believe what you will about the study. I think we can all imagine that there's some truth in that, right? I mean, I know I've heard many, many stories of family members who, since the election, suddenly have become estranged. Decades-long friendships gone out the window. Longtime neighbors who now ignore one another, who used to be close friends, who raised children together. We seem to be getting less and less skilled at tolerating one another across our differences. And it's clear that getting more entrenched in our differences isn't helping the world. And so what do? Well, I have good news. I believe that we, as Unitarian Universalists, have it in our religious DNA to navigate diverse beliefs. As Unitarian Universalists, we do not have shared beliefs, and so we are, at least not theological beliefs, and so we are a people of widely different theologies. In our congregations, we have atheists, pagans, Trinitarian Christians, agnostics, theists, pantheists, and others. We know how to get along despite our different theologies. And part of how we do that is that we are bound together by principles about how we wish to move in the world. Compassion, justice, equity, democracy, interdependence, freedom. Even though Theodore Parker was ostracized for his beliefs, Unitarian Universalism has become the non-creedal religion that Parker imagined in the 19th century. But there is one problem. Parker said we don't all have to think alike or live alike, but just live a life of love as much as we possibly can. And he went on to promote religious diversity, saying, we're all people, Quakers or Catholics, Unitarians or Baptists, there would be much less diversity of thought, character, and life, less of truth active in the world than now. And he said Christianity is not a system of doctrines, but rather a method of attaining oneness with God. Theodore Parker wasn't against religion. He just thought religion should make you closer to God, make you more loving, make you more just. The easy part of Unitarian Universalism, I think, is the part where we're throwing out doctrines. Many of us who grew up in creed-centered faiths are happy not to have some authority figure telling us what to believe anymore. But the latter part of that, oneness with God, is where I think our good news really has power. And that's the hard part. Parker's message of oneness with God spoke to a whole lot of people. People in that age, as well as in our age, are hungry for this message. Although he became ostracized in the Unitarian Church, he had all kinds of people listening to him and following him and interested in what he had to say. And the only space he could find in all of Boston that would rent to him and his followers was the Orpheum Theater in downtown Boston. That space agreed to rent to him, and so he started preaching there each week to crowds of up to 2,000 people. Some say this was America's first megachurch. And he was a fierce preacher. He did not let those privileged New Englanders off the hook. He said, Southern slavery is an institution which is in earnest. Northern freedom is an institution that is not in earnest. That is to say, white people in the South were fighting incredibly hard to maintain slavery. And white people in the North weren't so fervent as they perhaps should be in fighting for freedom. But that's the transient message. The permanent message is that Parker preached is that all people are of God. All people are of God. All people have a spark of the divine in them. And so we as religious people make sure that all people's circumstances reflect that belief that everybody has a spark of the divine. No person should ever be dehumanized, ever. His congregation housed formerly enslaved people, sheltering them from the horrors of enslavement, because that was part of how the congregation lived out this unchanging belief in a person's divinity. This is the unchanging law of God. This is our good news. But how do we affirm another person's divinity when the other is a person of privilege who is demonizing entire groups of people? When the other is separating families at the border, how do we affirm them? When the other is incarcerating people for drug addictions? When the other is spewing hate or spreading toxic lies? A few months ago, I attended a convention in St. Louis of a national nonprofit called Better Angels. And this group started in the days after the 2016 election when 10 Clinton supporters and 10 Trump supporters got together to see whether they could talk about issues that matter without all of the hate and polarization that usually comes in those discussions. This group sought the help of a marriage and family therapist whose job it is to encourage dialogue and sometimes unfriendly, sometimes maybe even hostile conversations. And that marriage and family therapist, who happens to be Unitarian Universalist, created a workshop where this politically diverse group of people could talk about important issues, but in ways that fostered understanding and connection instead of division and hate. And one of the elements of these workshops that I got to be part of in St. Louis are debates, where there are equal numbers of conservatives and liberals debating on a specific issue. And the goal that they offer in these debates is clear. You share your point of view, you share your side, but the purpose is not to change the other side's point of view. The purpose is not even to decide what is right and what is wrong. The purpose is to get closer to the truth. That's it. Get closer to the truth. Now, I want you to imagine what our political conversations would sound like if people weren't trying to prove themselves, or trying to convince everyone of their idea. But instead, what if political conversations were times when we and our leaders work together to get closer to the truth? Not to get elected, but to lead our country toward healing and wholeness and strength. What if Thanksgiving dinners were times when people, despite their differences, affirmed the inherent worth and dignity of one another and used conversation to draw closer? It's a powerful experiment. I believe that this is the work that we are meant to be doing. To realize that we are not just bound together as Unitarian Universalists, not just bound together as Democrats or Republicans or Northerners or Southerners, but that we are bound together with people across a wide spectrum of beliefs and identities and orientations and abilities. And because we are bound together, because we believe in something lasting and permanent and real that affirms everyone's inherent worth and dignity, we keep on doing that hard work of practicing love and peace in the midst of anxiety and conflict. And because God is in everyone, we keep looking for the stunning beauty within our human diversity. As Parker said in 1841, our commitment to this work does not demand all people to think alike, but to think uprightly and to get as near as possible to the truth. Not all people to live alike, but to live holy and get as near as possible to a life perfectly divine. I know it is so much easier to simply write off an entire group of people and decide that they are ignorant or arrogant or stupid or foolish or radical or careless. But what seems to be true is that underneath all of that, on both sides of every issue, there is a whole lot of shame and fear and pain. And here we all are, a nation of people in fight, flight, or freeze mode, all lashing out at each other because we can't stop getting emotionally hooked. And on the news and online, all you hear is the lashing out. You never hear the shame or the fear or the pain that's underneath all of that. But we have this faith in something that some people call God or spirit or love, and it dwells in every single one of us, every single one of us. I think of Theodore Parker, who lived during a time when the country was literally on the brink of civil war. And I imagine this light bulb went off for him, and he said, "Oh my gosh, I got it. It's not about doctrine. It's not about institutions. It's about love." And I suspect that some part of him thought that if he could just explain it just right, that people would see how to empower love in their own lives, and that's all they would care about. And they would spread justice and make sure that everyone uncovered their own light. When I translate just one word of Theodore Parker, changing God to love, here's what he said. In an age of corruption, as all ages are, Jesus stood and looked up to love. There was nothing between Jesus and love. The light of love shone down into the very depths of his soul. Jesus would have us do the same. That's all right. That's God right there. Jesus would have us do the same. Worship with nothing between us and love. Act, think, feel, live in perfect obedience to love. Love. It is too trite a word, really, but I don't have a better word. What in your life is magnifying love in this world? I wonder how your life speaks that truth of love. I wonder how your conversations empower love. I wonder how your social media is used to promote love in the world. Our faith invites us to draw out love everywhere, from everyone. And I know these are hard, hard times to practice our core values of love and peace and respect and compassion. John Stewart once said, if you don't stick to your values when they're being tested, they're not your values, they're just hobbies. But we are Unitarian Universalists. We are a people of values, not simply a people of hobbies. And I wish I could go back to that time some 20 years ago in the Oakland Hills. I wish I could have invited in those Jehovah's Witnesses and instead of trying to strip their faith from them, engage them in conversation in such a way that we might have together gotten a little closer to the truth. That I might have seen something of their light and they might have seen something of my light. That somehow my ego wouldn't have gotten so involved in that interaction. The good news, my friends, is this. We are part of a faith tradition in which we do not have to decide who is saved and who is not saved, who is good and not good, who is loved and not loved. All are saved. All are good. All are loved. May it be so.